we need to have people, whether, and it may or may not be another believer in your workplace. You may or may not have that, where you have somebody there that's like-minded enough to hold you accountable, but you need to have that relationship with another sister in the body, for women that are married, their spouse, somebody who can help them have a level of accountability where you're going to be open and honest with what those temptations are and how it's going, and so that we can have that hedge of protection against sin, or we know that somebody's going to be calling us on it before we get too far down that road. And then I sort of, towards the end of that chapter there, kind of also included a warning as it relates to self-control. And I think one of the important things that we see, which is a warning for us, it's a warning for us as we're helping one another, as well as the way that the context of this is written for a counselor to consider. But when there is a serious lack of self-control in one area of our life, we will often find that is bleeding over into other areas of our life. It is very rare that somebody is totally out of control in one aspect of their life and that is not affecting other places. And so typically when we find that we're really struggling with self-control in our finances, for example, well, then we may also be struggling with self-control as it relates to managing our time or our eating, or any number of things that we can throw out there as areas where we need to have self-control. Our tongues. I mean, usually if there's one real weak area, you're going to see that issue of self-control in other areas of our lives. And so the warning here as it relates to our workplace too is we don't want to compartmentalize our lives. We should be the same person that we are pretty much at work as we are at church, as we are in other contexts of our lives, at school, with our family, wherever. And we don't want to just say, well, this is you having an issue. If you're having an issue with your coworkers at work, that's probably a sign of other things that are happening. And even if it's because of persecution or their sin, which it certainly is probably an aspect of it, how you're choosing to respond in your workplace to those people is probably going to be insightful to you in terms of how you deal with family conflict, for example, or some other area of your life. We're whole integrated people, and we don't function. We try to compartmentalize things and function that way, but that's just not really the reality. Things definitely bleed over in our lives, and so we don't want to segment. While it's helpful to maybe think of different areas of our life and set goals and things like that, at the same time we need to recognize that lessons that we learn in one aspect of our lives we can really apply to other aspects as well, if that makes sense. And sometimes something that we've learned about the way that we interact with our family may really teach us something about how we're interacting with our coworkers, or vice versa. So we want to think across the whole life and look for the possibility of something that's kind of a dominant sin that we see throughout, if we're really struggling with something. Moving on, for the sake of time, I want to look here at quiet and gentle spirit as well, because I want to have time to talk about these things. And so this is coming out of the 1 Peter passage more directly. And I think this is kind of one of those passages that we quote so often in women, in ministry to women or with women. And it is so often misunderstood. And so looking at 1 Peter 3, we see, and I'm going to read more for the sake of context. In the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives, as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior. Your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair and wearing gold jewelry or putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. For in this way, in former times, the holy women also, who hoped in God, used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you have become her children if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear. So many people think, oh, that means that I just don't talk. Like, if I'm going to have a quiet and gentle spirit, I guess that means that I'm not supposed to talk. And that when I do talk, I'm supposed to use a very soft tone of voice. And then that means that I'm being quiet and gentle. So people who are more naturally reserved, maybe, might be perceived as being quiet and gentle, and people who are more outgoing and talkative are not, by our sort of weak understanding of the passage. But yet, if God is commanding this of us, then we have to know that it's not based on personality. It's not based on some personality trait that's fixed, which, by the way, personality traits aren't fixed, but we can change. God's made that clear. Not only can we change, we need to change sometimes if what we're doing is sinful. But it's so we know it's not based on just, some people are naturally this way and some people naturally are not. If God's commanding it of us, then He's going to enable us to obey it. And so we have to dig a little deeper to understand what it means. And quietness is probably better associated with meekness. And that's also kind of a confusing term, I think, for us today. But in the quote here on page 54, it says about meekness, Christian meekness is based on humility, which is not a natural quality, but an outgrowth of a renewed nature, or renewed, being somebody who's now been saved, has a new nature. To the pagan, the word often implied condescension. To the Christian, it implies submission. The Christian quality in its manifestation reveals all that was best in the heathen virtue: mildness, gentleness, equanimity. But these manifestations toward men are emphasized as outgrowths of the spiritual relation to God. We tend to think meekness and we think wimpy. And that is not at all what meekness in a scriptural sense means. And I think that this Carolyn McCulley quote is probably the most helpful on that point. And she says, meekness is the strength to govern our sin. Meekness will help us, and she's specifically here talking to single women, but it applies to all of us, to avoid that defensive brittleness and a strident voice, and instead demonstrate true strength of character as we govern our passions and our tongues. So meekness is not about, or quietness is not about the volume necessarily of our voice or how often we speak, but rather whether or not we're being self-controlled and whether or not we're demonstrating godly character in the way that we communicate with people. So, as we all know in our battle against sin, if meekness has to do with having enough self-control to battle our sin, that it's not a wimpy characteristic at all. It's something that's very hard to have, and it's something that's worth striving after. And it's important to also remember that Peter in this context is dealing with people who are suffering and that are under intense persecution. And so he's exhorting them to how to live out their faith in the midst of this intense suffering. Which kind of adds to the understanding that we should bring to the passage. In the midst of suffering, he's calling them to be adorned with this imperishable quality of a quiet and gentle spirit. And he's contrasting that with physical adornment, with physical beauty, clothes, and jewelry. So the point, I think, of that contrast is that he's teaching them that their inner beauty, the character that they bring, is going to have a greater impact for the gospel than the outer adornment. And that even excessive outer adornment could distract from the gospel. And again, it's not so much, the point isn't so much about what the outward adornment is, but whether or not it's excessive and whether or not it's distracting from the gospel, and rather than adorning the gospel. He's not saying, to never, that there's not any value to that, but rather that it not be seen as more important than the value of their character. He also, interestingly, in this passage, in the same flow of thought with Quiet and Gentle Spirit, really deals with this issue of nagging. Basically, he says that and it's not respectful for them to nag their husbands, even if the nagging has to do with the gospel. And in this particular instance, quiet does, to some degree, have to involve not speaking, or at least not speaking in such a way that the gospel is continually being presented in an unwelcome and disrespectful manner. And the point, again, here is that the message of the gospel may be offensive, and it will be offensive to those to whom are perishing. But you don't want the messenger to be the stumbling block. You don't want yourself to be the stumbling block. You don't want to be the offense. Let the gospel be the offense. And so he's speaking to these women, and he is calling them to be respectful in the midst of their husband's unbelief. And as we move into this idea of the heart issue, really she's able to be that because she has entrusted herself to Christ. And while this is true in the suffering of this wife in a marriage situation, that also needs to be what's true of us in our workplace if we're suffering. We need to find peace in trusting ourselves to the heart of submission to God and realizing that we have a sovereign, holy God who has placed us in that place. And if that's where he's put us, then we need to honor him in the midst of that. So it's again, not a function of our personality, but it's a byproduct of the woman's relationship with the Lord. And it's us choosing to trust in the providence and sovereignty of God rather than responding with fear or anger or manipulation to the situations around us, which is really what those are the things that ultimately Peter was warning against. And so for women in the workplace, when the pressure comes, our hearts are revealed. And you guys have probably all heard this analogy before, but if you squeeze a sponge, whatever's inside that sponge is what's going to come out, right? If it's water, if it's been sitting in a tub of water and you squeeze it, water's going to come out. If you just wiped up a bunch of punch that spilled on the floor, then punch is going to come out. Our circumstances do not necessarily put anything into us. What they do is they squeeze us. And what's in us is what comes out in those circumstances. And so if we have been growing in faith and trust in the Lord, then that's how we are going to respond when we're put through the test. But if we're more concerned about the world, if we're full of fear and anxiety, then that's what our circumstances are going to reveal about our hearts. And so what we can... And there's going to be some of both of that when we're suffering. I mean, the reality is we're all still in process of being sanctified, and so, we're going to get into a situation where we're tempted and where we're in some sort of suffering or difficulty, and we may reveal some fear in our hearts that we may find there. But we can, when we know that that's what's happening, we can rejoice in the reality that God's helping to reveal those things to us, and we can learn and grow in response to them as we see those things be revealed. And one of the, I talk here about kind of how we can respond, and he used this example from Ed Welch's book, Depression, A Stubborn Darkness, and he talks about how when we're in potentially depression or just under really difficult circumstances where we're discouraged, that we need to call out to the Lord, and that's the example that we've been given in the Psalms in particular of people who under intense distress call out to the Lord. And he points to